US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has wrapped up his three-day tour of the Gulf. Regional states want a greater say in security after coming under attack during the Iran war. So, can Washington rebuild trust with its regional allies? And will the Gulf states be able to steer the future of the Strait of Hormuz? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been holding talks in the Gulf. He wants to reassure America's allies in the region that Washington will prioritise their security in the wake of the Iran agreement. While meeting GCC officials in Manama, Rubio said that the US wants a permanent deal with Tehran, but not at any price. He also insisted Iran should not charge for ships to cross the Strait of Hormuz and should never possess a nuclear weapon. All of this comes with the background of the unprecedented attacks that were launched against Gulf states by Iran. The GCC is now pushing for a bigger say in what happens in its own backyard. This includes security and the Strait of Hormuz. But can Washington ease Gulf concerns and ensure their voices will be heard? We'll put that to our panel of guests in a moment, but first this report from Amma Botang.
The US Secretary of State came to the Gulf region on a diplomatic mission to reassure states. Marco Rubio says he understands the security and economic concerns of countries in the region. That's after the US and Iran held their first round of negotiations that concluded in Switzerland on Monday, following last week's signing of a Memorandum of Understanding on reaching a permanent end to the war.
And the message that I come with is that we want to ensure that in any decisions that are made throughout this negotiating process, the interests of our partners and our allies in the region are always taken into account. That there is no part of this deal that's undertaken that in any way undermines the security, the stability, or the prosperity of any of our partners in the Gulf region.
Tehran attacked US military bases and energy facilities in the Gulf during the US-Israel war, costing billions of dollars. The 6 Gulf Cooperation Council nations are strategic US allies that host US military bases. Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz cut off a vital shipping route. Gulf nations rely on the strait for oil and liquefied natural gas exports. The agreement between Washington and Tehran requires Iran to let shipping flow freely through the strait for 60 days. Vessels are moving, but at a pace far below pre-war levels.
Today, we see a glimmer of hope for our region, and the welcome diplomatic efforts resulting in an end to hostilities, with the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding between the United States and Iran, supported by the mediation of Pakistan and Qatar, and the restoration of free and secure navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. In this regard, we welcome the announcement by Oman of a temporary maritime corridor for vessels wishing to transit through the strait.
Oman, which shares the waterway with Iran, announced on Wednesday that it's providing temporary shipping lanes through the strait in coordination with the International Maritime Organization, a move criticized by Iran's Revolutionary Guard, which is now urging vessels to coordinate with its forces before passing. Qatar was a joint mediator with Pakistan during the last round of negotiations in Switzerland. It also holds $6 billion of Iran's frozen assets. The release of Iranian assets and lifting of US sanctions are part of the agreement between Iran and the US. Rubio says the US will ensure that negotiations with Iran won't go against the interests of its Gulf allies. After the uncertainty of the past few months, countries in the region are looking for stability. Amma Botang, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
So lots to discuss with our guests who are joining us on today's Inside Story. Here in our studio, we're joined by Abdulla Banndar Etaibi. He's an assistant professor in international affairs at Qatar University. In Washington, D.C., Gordon Gray, a former US ambassador and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. And also in Washington, D.C., Sina Tusi, a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, focusing on US-Iran relations. Ambassador Gordon Gray, let me start with you. What is your understanding of the reason for the Secretary of State's visit? What was he trying to achieve on this tour?
If I had to put it into two words, I would say damage control. The United States and Israel started this war on February 28th without prior consultation with the U.S. partners in the Gulf. They suffered the brunt of the Iranian response, both in terms of the missile attacks and in terms of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which prevented them from exporting energy to the rest of the world. And so Secretary Rubio is, as he said in the words we just heard, he's trying to reassure the Gulf allies of the United States that the United States will not make any agreements with Iran that undermine their security or economic interests. Whether he's successful, whether they believe him is another story, but that's what he's attempting to do.
Sina, how would you describe the state, the temperature of Gulf-US relations right now?
Yes, well, ultimately, a fundamental foundation of U.S. relations with the Gulf fell through with this war. That the U.S. was supposed to be part of the quid pro quo, undergirding the strategic relations between the Gulf states, the GCC, and the U.S. is that they're providing energy, and the U.S. is providing for their security and providing for the security of the sea lanes there and the Strait of Hormuz. And this was a war that the GCC, by and large, did not want. And there was a lot of advocacy from them to prevent it. And the U.S. launched this war of aggression, really, against Iran with maximalist aims, and they bore the brunt of it. I mean, they hosted the U.S. bases that were used to attack Iran, and their infrastructure was attacked. The Strait of Hormuz was attacked, and we're seeing that their economic model, their political economic model that rests on investor confidence, foreign investment, that this is under threat, and they've borne a huge cost in this war. And now there are reports of them rethinking their relations with the U.S., having détente with Iran, engagement with Iran. And now, so Marco Rubio in this context is there to try to patch things up and I think try to salvage what the U.S. can of this relationship.
Abdulla, let me read you something that Secretary Rubio said in recent hours. This alliance, and he's talking about the US and the Gulf states, was put to the test based on recent events, and it has passed. You're an academic and well-connected here in Doha. Is that how people in the Gulf see it, that they passed the test?
Well, it's not a clear statement by Marco Rubio, to be honest. Because the thing is, this is decades-long relations between the US and the GCC. And every time there is an issue in the region, this relation changes and develops in a certain way. Like with the Arab Spring, with the regional turmoil, we saw economic forums, we saw some cooperation committees being established between the two parties. So I think Marco Rubio is just referring to some sort of more of developing an interest, a new shift in the relations. Because in the last decades, we saw the JCPOA, the whole regional countries, they just discovered the deal. Now they are, in a way, on the table. We have Qatar and Pakistan, the regional countries. They are the bridge between the US and Iran, but there are others as well. So I don't think he is referring to a big test of relations more than a big test that is to find the deal that actually serves the interests of all regional countries, including and also the US.
Sina, I mean, one of the problems here with the trust and where trust may have been broken is the start of the war, February the 28th, because Gulf allies were not fully consulted, and those that were consulted were against the war, were they not?
Yes, it's very interesting because we see that in this period of escalation between the US and Iran, really since 2018, when Trump left the nuclear deal, you saw that whereas in the past that many of the Gulf states were supportive of a more aggressive US approach towards Iran initially, but then after the first round of escalations in 2018, 2019, the first tanker war that actually occurred in 2019, the strike on Saudi Aramco in 2020, you actually saw many of the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, pivot towards engagements with Iran. And I think that was based on an understanding that a war with Iran would carry direct costs for them, that they are, at the end of the day, permanent neighbors with Iran. The geography, at the end of the day, is the greatest determinant of geopolitics. And thus, we saw this pivot towards them against this kind of more hawkish approach towards Iran, towards diplomatic engagement. And that kind of lasted more or less. Saudi and Iran restarted normalized diplomatic relations in 2023. And in the head up to this war, by and large, these states were against this war. And I think based on the calculation that they would bear the biggest costs and it would become a catastrophe. And that's exactly what happened. So I think this is really a kind of we told you so moment for many in the Persian Gulf. And the U.S. Started this crisis that really, they bore the costs of, and now they're trying to revamp this relationship.
Gordon, perhaps you can help me with a little bit of a history lesson. Can I take you back to February the 14th, 1945, aboard a US naval cruiser, the USS Quincy? Then the first king of Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud, met President Franklin D. Roosevelt on Valentine's Day, the beginning of what some might say was a strategic wedding between Saudi Arabia and the US, and expanded as years went on to the rest of the Gulf. Explain the basic transaction that's gone on over the years.
Basic transaction is that the United States has supported Saudi Arabia actually since before that meeting in 1945. The United States supported the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is in terms of oil exploration, in terms of subventions to the King of Saudi Arabia. But since then, to get to the heart of your question, it has also supported the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in terms of security. And there was always the implicit exchange or transaction, to use your word, of the United States would provide security, and the Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf would continue to provide oil to the international markets. That implicit understanding became explicit in 1980 in President Carter's State of the Union address, when he articulated what has come to be known as the Carter document that the free flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz was an essential for U.S. security, and the United States would take all appropriate measures to keep it flowing.
So, Abdulla, we understand then the history of this. The US is supposed to provide security, and yet the US's action going to war was what caused the insecurity, which led, the actions of Iran as well, but led to the bombardment of the Gulf. Is the anger in this region, is it only directed at Iran or also partly at the US?
No, for sure, James, it's going to be towards Iran, because Iran, the one who launched all the attacks, and we saw their projectiles in the skies of the GCC, countries who worked very hard for this war to not happen in the first place. But when it comes to the US, there is definitely some sort of frustration with the US decision, as there were discussions and negotiations taking place with the Omani mediation. But then the US preferred to go to the hard power and to strike Iran, and just bringing the whole region into more chaos. So these things, these dynamics are very frustrating to the regional countries, because they are stuck in the middle. They just wake up and just found their region being the battlefield, where everyone is just using the GCC, the Strait of Hormuz, and everything in the region basically as a bargaining chip to win a better deal. And now we are back to the negotiations table, which was something that the regional countries called for, since dialogue is the only way for peace and prosperity and stability.
And we have this interim deal. This is the Memorandum of Understanding. It's still, though, seen a very fragile situation, is it not? And it's only with deft diplomacy in Switzerland, I was there covering that for Al Jazeera, that this stayed on track, because Lebanon looked like it was going to derail it. How worried do you think they are in the Gulf that there still seem to be problems The issue of frozen funds, for example, the US says that Iran has to buy agricultural products from the US. The issue of nuclear inspectors, the IAEA, the US says they're going to go in, Iran says they're not. And Hormuz. How worried do you think in the region people are worried that this memorandum of understanding could become a memorandum of misunderstanding?
Yes, well, first, I would just push back on the idea that, ultimately the Gulf states were kind of innocent bystanders in this war, that ultimately they did, allow the US to come and establish these bases and this infrastructure and use their territory to attack Iran. Again, in this war of aggression that, started with the opening blow of bombing a school, killing 180 schoolgirls, destroying critical Iranian infrastructure, from water reservoirs to universities to medical and pharmaceutical companies to bridges to a lot of civilian harm. So ultimately, there was ground-to-air missiles launched from Kuwait, the Bahraini base, including Qatar, the Al Udeid air base, from Saudi Arabia. So it's not like they were innocent bystanders. But again, this goes to the question of their fundamental security doctrine being challenged. And yes, they did allow the U.S. to establish these bases. They formed this strategic alliance with the US that ultimately backfired on them. And now they're trying to pivot, rebalance. There's this reports of them trying to engage Iran, form a new security structure in the Persian Gulf. And we'll see how that evolves. Now, with this memorandum of understanding, it is indeed very vulnerable. I think there's many forces against it, chiefly Israel, but also within Washington, many hawks, many trying to create a political cost for Trump. And I think, the biggest vulnerabilities thus far have been the Lebanon issue. Iran has linked it to that, getting a durable ceasefire, getting Israeli withdrawal from there. We'll have to see how much that progresses. And then all these questions of Iran getting access to its frozen funds, exactly how transit through Strait of Hormuz is going to work. And the memorandum is really linking progress and all these clauses to the final clause of the memorandum, which is negotiating a final agreement, a more comprehensive agreement between the US and Iran. And that is very much in the air. I think we'll have to see how much progress is made on all these other terms of the memorandum.
Abdulla, I noticed you made a face while he was talking. You disagreed with some of that. So if you could perhaps pick up, but also how worried are countries in this region that this won't work, that there is a possibility we could return to war?
Well, there are different parts there's a lot to unpack, basically, James. One, and firstly, there are American presence in the region, and this is based on the security arrangements within national military bases. This is number one. When it comes to the MOU, and if things are not working very well, I don't think, if we want to have a big deal that fixes everything, this is very hard. Now, what we know is basically we have different files and issues that are shaping up. We have Lebanon, we have Hormuz, and we have the nuclear deal. And the thing is, I think the Iranians are trying to push for one file in order to get more concessions in the other one. So they're being more hard to negotiate with on Hormuz in order to get more concessions in Lebanon, as Lebanon is way more important for them, with Hezbollah as the proxy, and because they're expanding in the region under the umbrella of Hezbollah, not under the umbrella of Iran. If we look back, James, to the history, we see Hezbollah who actually operated within Syria, Hezbollah who trained the Houthis in Yemen, not the IRGC. They are actually working within the umbrella of Hezbollah. Therefore, I think Iran values Lebanon more than Hormuz, but Hormuz is the way to get the concessions.
And Hormuz, Gordon, is the thing that is affecting the economies in this region, but affecting the world economy. Donald Trump at the G7 said there were only 4 weeks of oil reserves left in the world. And there seem to be problems with the Hormuz deal, part of the deal, in terms of whether any fees will be charged. The US says no tolls. I think Iran and Oman are talking instead about service fees. But does it amount to the same thing? And how much of a problem is this?
Well, it's going to be a tremendous problem if it's not successfully resolved. The distinction between tolls and service fees, when neither has been charged in the past, is going to be lost on oil companies, on insurance companies, and ultimately on consumers, because it will all have the same effect, which is to raise the price of energy to consumers. At the same time, Iran risks overplaying its hand. It also has a vested interest in making sure that energy continues to flow through the strait, and so that the Gulf countries don't increasingly shift to alternate routes to ship their energy and export their energy products.
Sina, we've had President Trump making very controversial comments, even while the meeting was taking place in Switzerland, even while his vice president was negotiating. But we've also had the other side using Twitter. Mohammed Bagher Ghalibaf, let me read this post that he put on X. America falsely claims our unfrozen assets will buy their agriculture. Interesting. The only crop we're harvesting is what you planted, decades of mistrust. It's organic, abundant and homegrown, but apparently the US only exports GMO soybeans, broken promises and trash talk. How dangerous is this sort of rhetoric at this very fragile stage?
Yes, well, the MOU actually, among its terms and its clauses, it actually prohibits threats, and so we saw that, as you said, in that first day of the talks in Switzerland, on Sunday, that Trump was on Fox News saying the Iranian negotiators may not return, like basically implicitly threatening to kill them and saying he might go to war again. And this reportedly led the Iranians to at least briefly leave the meeting or try to end the meeting. And then eventually the mediators had to bring it back and progress was made. But I think what we're seeing is happening is, a lot of this stuff is domestic political theater. That Donald Trump is someone who kind of, on his end, invents reality to benefit him, to play well with his base. So he'll twist anything to look like a victory for him. And so I think, he's trying to sell this deal at home amongst a lot of backlash and hawkish backlash. So he's trying to be like, Iranians are buying our products. They are not going to do XYZ, like charged fees or things like this. And the Iranians, at the same time, as you mentioned with Ghalibaf's tweet, that they also have all these political constraints. There's actually a lot of criticisms of this MOU in Iran, their own hardliners, but even beyond that, this issue of distrust, that the U.S. surprise attacked them twice. The U.S. was the one that left the JCPOA, assassinated their leader. And so now coming back to the negotiating table is something that many in Iran view with immense skepticism. So this just shows how hard this diplomatic process is, and all the factors that could go wrong. And these kind of rhetoric is definitely not helpful, I would argue.
Abdulla, do you think some of the Gulf states, yes, they have long-term relations with the US, but do you think they might supplement their security by looking elsewhere as well? For example, Saudi Arabia has a deal signed last year with Pakistan. Can we see more of that? Could we even see China getting involved? It has huge investments in this region. Could it get involved in the security side?
Well, when we talk about security measures, James, we have to look at it from two different perspectives. From the Gulf perspective, I think they are open to rely more on more security measures, more security arrangements. We saw Ukraine, for example, passing by here in the region, in Saudi, in Abu Dhabi, and in Doha as well. So we could see something like that. But we had Pakistan with Saudis, we have the Turkey with Qatar. So we could see that. When it comes to the perspective of the other, when you talk about China, for example, I don't think the Chinese are well interested in having security measures in the region. They are more reliant on economic measures. This is number one. Secondly, if they going to consider having an arrangement with the GCC, what does that mean to their relations with Iran? And this is a different question. Therefore, I think it's a two sides to look at it. From the GCC, I think they are open to have more security arrangements in the future.
Gordon, I've heard some in the GCC say that they need to turn the GCC into a sort of NATO in the Middle East, but I've heard other comments, in fact, for many years, including conversations I had with the UN Secretary General about this, that instead there should be a little bit like the end of the Cold War, the Helsinki process. There should be some sort of Helsinki process for this region. Do you think either of those ideas are likely?
I don't see them as terribly likely. No, I think in the case of a more unified GCC military alliance along the lines of NATO, there's too much distrust within among the GCC countries, and most recently the apparent friction between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Last decade, it was between Saudi Arabia and the United Emirates on one hand and Qatar on the other. Similarly, an Helsinki Accords type agreement modeled along the lines of the OSCE, I think that's more aspirational than realistic at this moment, because I think there's just far too much distrust of Iran at the moment to see that come about.
Abdulla, do you think what we've seen in recent months, and we've seen all sorts of things in the Middle East over the years, but for this region, these are events that will change this region for good? There's no going back to how it was before February the 28th.
I agree with you. I think so. I think, James, what we witnessed in the region is not something easy. To see projectiles in your sky, to see the Strait of Hormuz being closed after years of threats from the Iranian side, to see the Israeli interest is taking over the American decision making to launch a war against Iran as well. There are a lot of things happening, and this is something I think has been coming for years. Like since the war in Gaza on October 7th, we've seen political escalation in the region, and this is something. If it's not stopped with open and free dialogue among the regional countries, I think will take us to more escalation and more conflicts. And this is something I don't think the regional countries want. This is. Do
you think people here, though, are breathing a sigh of relief, or are they wary? Do people you speak to, not just in academic circles and political circles, but are people concerned this isn't over?
Well, I think so, yeah. People agree that it's very difficult for Iran and the US to reach a deal, because they still having conflicting statements. You just mentioned now Ghalibaf's post, and we always talk about Trump's post on as well. So these types of posts actually creating some sort of mistrust between the two parties, but also create more worry in the region, as mediators not only mediating between them behind closed doors, but also what goes in front of the people. And this is something quite worrying for the region.
Abdulla Banndar al-Etaibi, Gordon Gray and Seenat Tusi, thank you very much for joining us. The high-stakes diplomacy in the region continues. You can follow the latest on Al Jazeera with further context and analysis on our website, aljazeera.com. Your thoughts are welcome too. Go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or you can use X. There we are, at AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from the Inside Story studio, from me, James Bays, and the team here. But stay tuned. Al Jazeera's coverage continues in just a moment.